Have you ever heard of the Dragon Gate? It's a Chinese myth of a huge arch at the top of a massive waterfall. Legend has it, any fish that jumps over it will be rewarded for their efforts and turned into a dragon. In Pokemon, this myth was the inspiration for Magikarp and Gyarados. And more than just being a great piece of lore, this design style of a super weak Pokemon suddenly becoming a god of destruction is one of the most satisfying and iconic archetypes in the Pokemon franchise. And it didn't stop with Magikarp. What started with the legend of the Dragon's Gate has led to over a dozen Pokemon with similar design philosophies. In this video, we'll be examining the history of Pokemon's hidden dragon archetype throughout every Pokemon game. How did it start? What went wrong? And why does everything lead back to Gyarados? Generation 1. Red, blue, and yellow. Now, in order to understand where things went wrong, we need to start at the very beginning to see why Magikarp worked so well in the first place. Magikarp is introduced to the player in Pokemon Red and Blue on Route 3 in a Pokemon Center. A traveling salesman offers to sell you one, claiming it to be a great deal. Now, to the unsuspecting player, this ends up being a total scam. Magikarp is not only terrible, but also plentiful, being the only possible catch from an old rod. But anyone outside of those brand new to the series knows that what you were just handed is a ticking time bomb. Magikarp is a weapon of potential mass destruction, and all you need to do to get it is reach level 20. And with that being just one level below that of the second gym leader, this may seem incredibly broken. Getting to level 20, however, is an incredibly hard task, because in Generation 1, there are no easy ways to level Pokemon up like an experience share. If you want to get Gyarados before Misty, all you can do is swap grind. This means placing Magikarp at the front of your party and then swapping to a teammate that can fight for it and share the experience. So even using the 2 rare candies available, swap grinding from level 5 to 18 is a monumental grind. But just like the carp at the bottom of the waterfall, the player is rewarded for their persistence. Because Gen 1 Gyarados in particular is an absolute monster. Not only does it have the 125 attack and great bulk that we're used to, it also benefits from Gen 1 only having a single special stat. So rather than there being individual stats for special attack and defense, Gen 1 Pokemon only have one stat that calculate both roles. And Gyarados was blessed by having its special stat be its modern day special defense of 100 rather than its special attack, which is only 60. So this effectively gives Gyarados a modern day base stat of 580, which is on par with the legendary beasts and further trios. You've got the potential to get a legendary Pokemon before the second gym, but it's gonna take you like 2 hours. And there's actually even more to it as to why Gyarados doesn't feel broken in Generation 1. The first thing is that Gyarados' power is actually held back during the first few gyms. Starmie is no pushover, and Gyarados only edges it out with stats and neutral damage moves. Third gym is Electric, where it can't do anything, and it's really only against Erica, where you can teach it Ice Beam, where it starts to perform well in the gyms. So up until this point, all Gyarados really does is ensure a colossal stomping on every junior trainer. And yet there's still more that holds Gyarados back from feeling overpowered. There are a lot of Pokemon in Gen 1 that can do almost as good a job of Gyarados, but for a fraction of the cost. Nidoran is all but ready to roll the moment you catch it, and it hits max power in Nidoking at just level 16. You've also got Pokemon like Clefable, Wartortle, and Ivysaur that make the early game nearly as easy. And what about the rest of the game? Well, yeah, Gyarados crushes Erica, Koga, Sabrina, Blaine, and Giovanni. But despite this great performance, its high investment cost never goes away. You can technically acquire the good and super rod after the third gym, but this only gives the player access to level 15 Magikarp. And that means that Gyarados is never free. So even waiting to postpone to the third or fourth gym is going to have its costs. And so overall, despite being the Pokemon that brings the highest total value to a playthrough, there's really no sense that Gyarados is overpowered in Generation 1. And you know, it's easy to clown on Gen 1 for having weird game design, but this is an instance where I actually think they nailed it the first time around. Unfortunately, as we continue through the generations, we're going to see how this design philosophy becomes mismanaged. And ultimately, this is going to lead to what I believe is a serious detriment to the series. But before we get there, we need to look at one more Pokemon that embodies what I call the hidden dragon archetype. And that is Abra. Abra is quite rare and extremely hard to catch because it always teleports on turn 1. So already there's a pretty high cost to getting one. And just like Magikarp, it's utterly useless when you catch it. Abra only knows teleport, and so once again, you have to swap grind it to level 16 before making use of it. And then at level 16, 17, it turns into Kadabra, which is a monster. But what differs from the Abra line is that this Pokemon can't actually reach its full potential unless you trade it. Now, if you're just a casual player running your game on Delta on your iPhone, you're not going to have access to Alakazam. And in that case, Kadabra offers like a really huge power spike, but it's not so strong that it will just stomp the entirety of the rest of the game. However, if you're doing that trade at level 16 and getting Alakazam from the get-go, yeah, that breaks the game. And sure, that is really broken, but it's not an instance that I think is actually that common, especially in today's standards. Most players these days are going to be stuck with Kadabra. I think overall, what we can learn from Generation 1 is that in order for this design to work, it needs a series of checks and balances. And so now that we've examined the roots of this archetype, we can move forward through the games to see how it is ultimately fumbled. We'll follow both the evolution of Gyarados' build along with the new hidden dragon Pokemon that emerge in the upcoming generations. Gen 2. Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Johto is by far the biggest oddity when it comes to the hidden dragon trope. Game Freak was in a very experimental phase here, and this resulted in some Pokemon that take inspiration from the idea, but don't really fully embody the trope. A good example of this is Teddiursa. The concept of a cute teddy bear turning into a monstrous bear is quite reminiscent of the Magikarp line. It's not exactly a one-to-one, however, as Teddiursa is by no means helpless. It's got great attack, and with tons of access to strong stab normal moves, it doesn't fully fit into the archetype. But it is cool to observe how single aspects of the trope made their way into new Gen 2 Pokemon. Another group of Pokemon that inadvertently take inspiration from this trope are the babies, specifically Elekid, Magby, and Smoochum. They'll start as small, seemingly helpless Pokemon that turn into great ones. But similar to Teddiursa, these Pokemon all start out pretty strong. Being babies, they also just have their own identity already. So if we're gonna zone in a bit, there's really only two Pokemon we need to look at. The first is actually Phanpy. Also available in Crystal Mornings, Phanpy is both an early catch and really bad performer. Its high stat is HP, and up until the point of evolution at 25, its only attacking move is Tackle. To make matters worse, it can't even learn the ground TM Dig, meaning its only available stab move is the 20 power Mudslap TM. While it can actually at least do something, Phanpy is pretty awful. But if you've ever managed to evolve it into Donphan, you might also know that it's worth the grind. Donphan has 90 HP and 120 in both defense and attack. Like, this thing has higher base stats than Golem while also removing 2 of its 4 times weaknesses. Now, it doesn't have a great learn set, but if you just give it Rollout and Strength, it's going to do really well for Gen 2 standards. And once you give it the Earthquake TM from Victory Road, this thing really is a monster. And what's really funny is that despite all this, I'm not actually sure if Phanpy was inspired by Magikarp. Like, it checks nearly every box, but if you look at Gen 2 learn sets, this doesn't feel far off from many other Pokemon. To me, it almost feels like Donphan was an unintentional hidden dragon. I should also mention that Swinub and Piloswine feel like a similar case, but because it's even less intentional and they show up so late, I don't even want to consider giving them the status. Now, what's crazy is there's a Gen 2 Pokemon that literally just copied Magikarp. Okay, check this out. Sunkern. 30 points in every stat, doesn't learn a good move until 46, a stone evolution locked behind a poorly laid out and seemingly arbitrary bug catching competition that can only be attempted once a day. Sunkern is the Gen 2 equivalent of Magikarp. And that's really unfortunate because Sunflora is not the Gen 2 equivalent of Gyarados. And that's because Gyarados has 540 base stat while Sunflora has 425. Like, dude, my man Dunsparce is almost putting up better numbers than Sunflora. And this, unfortunately, is really just a case of Gen 2 Pokemon always being bad. And that's fine. Like, this isn't an evaluation of, like, how good are these Pokemon compared to Gyarados. I'm just really asking, like, why make this Pokemon? Like, I think about another reality where Sunflora had gotten the same treatment as Gyarados. Imagine 125 special attack, maybe 100 in special defense and in HP, maybe even a bit more defense. This would have been far outside the norms of Gen 2, but it would have made for a really interesting Pokemon. So in short, Gen 2 did experiment with the hidden dragon archetype, and we simply got a few Pokemon that took traits from the Magikarp line. Speaking of, what happened to our buddy Gyarados? Well, it actually got a nerf. With the introduction of special defense and attack, Gyarados' defense stayed at 100 while its special attack dropped to 60. In fact, this is like the worst version of Gyarados in the history of Pokemon. And yet, despite that, it's still one of the best playthrough Pokemon in the game. And that's because most Pokemon in Johto suck. Gyarados is one of the few Pokemon you can get that has good attack, decent moves, and over 500 base stats. Gyarados is also way easier to get. The player can reach Olivine after the 3rd gym, get a good rod, and instantly catch a level 20 Magikarp. You can then give it 1 level, teach it Surf and Strength, and you have a Pokemon that will carry you through the entire game. But what's even crazier is if you just want to postpone that 1 gym, you can go get yourself a level 30 shiny Gyarados at the Lake of Rage. And this is where things get really dicey. You've got a guaranteed encounter at level 30 where anything else you might catch around this area is 10 or more levels below, in a game where there is very little available EXP. And so in Gen 2, Gyarados just kind of becomes this thing that is like not all that impressive. Like 90% of the game, you're just using strength or return and just kind of outstatting, bullying your way through the slew of terrible junior trainers. It also resists Chalk, it 2-shots Jasmine Steelix, whilst Price even puts in pretty good work on Claire. But it's just this thing that is super uninteresting to use, and unfortunately there's not a lot of better options than it. And so this is where we start to see cracks forming in the wall. With 0 investment cost and amazing capabilities, why would you use anything but Gyarados? Gen 3. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. While Gen 2 gave us some unconventional experiments, in Gen 3 we're delivered a huge refinement of the archetype, because Hoenn actually gives us 3 unique takes on the hidden dragon. First though, it's worth noting that while pseudo-legendaries already share a lot in common with these Pokemon, Beldum took a particularly high level of inspiration. Because it only knows the move Takedown, Beldum feels particularly reminiscent of Magikarp. But the 2 things that really differentiate pseudos from what we're looking at today are a more linear power slope along with a super light evolution. And the first Pokemon that fully embodies the hidden dragon trope is, of course, Feebas. Milotic is Pokemon's most literal translation of Gyarados. And you can even see that in its stats, sharing the same numerical values. But more so, just like with Gen 1 Magikarp, Feebas is terrible and takes a lot of work to evolve. It's even got the serpentine body. What's really interesting about this line though is that it actually manages to not feel like a cheap copy. And outside of an amazing design itself, I think a lot of this is due with its beauty evolution. Beauty was a new feature added in Gen 3, so it plays as a creative take on Gyarados rather than just a boring copy. Now it's in the Ralts line, however, where we see a genuine refinement of this entire idea. Ralts starts only knowing Growl, but unlike Abra or Magikarp, the swap grind only requires a few levels before getting Confusion. With this, you capture a lot of the same feel as Magikarp and Abra, but without things being quite as tedious. The key thing here though is that even once you get a damaging move, Ralts is still terrible. And with 278 base stats, so is Kirlia. It's not going to be until level 30, which is probably like after Norman, where you're even going to get a good Pokemon. So the grind is longer than Gen 1 Magikarp, but in terms of feel, it's a little more bearable. And that's really down to a sense of progression. See, rather than just a mindless grind of 15 levels, the whole idea is experimented here, and the Ralts line is given a bunch of checkpoints to keep you engaged with its journey. Step 1, catch a Ralts and swap grind it. Step 2, Confusion at level 6. Okay, cool, now it can do something. Next up, Double Team at 11, Kirlia at 20. That should actually help for Brawly. Calm Mind at 21. Sick. Shockwave after Watson. Psychic at 26. And then at level 30, we finally make it over that gate and are rewarded for our efforts. Enter Gardevoir, 115 special defense, 125 special attack, and oh hey, it already has all the moves it needs. It's designed so that you get intermediary rewards that maintains a sense of progression. And so while Gardevoir is insane in the second half of Hoenn, its power feels justified knowing how much work it took to get. And this design is really a big part of why it's such a fan favorite. Any Pokemon can be strong, but it seems to be oftentimes that the ones that have a journey are the ones that leave the biggest lasting impact. Now, Slackoth is our third hidden dragon, and the most creative deviation of the 3. Slackoth comes super early, and its only contribution is utility in Encore and Yawn. It's not complete dead weight, but it requires a lot of babying until you get it to 18. Vigoroth is a significant improvement, but with 18 levels to go, it's not exactly a top contributor. And so the way this line starts is it's feeling like a linear progression curve, and then you get slacking, which of course gives you that power spike that still feels very much like Hidden Dragon. Same base stats as Kyogre and Groudon. Even with the Truon ability, it feels pretty good. Now, in terms of feel, slacking doesn't totally give us the same vibe as the previous Hidden Dragons we've looked at. It does kind of feel like a pseudo. It's like a diet pseudo or like a super pseudo. Game Freak just takes a lot of creative liberties with this design, but I do very much think that it follows in a pretty big sense the Hidden Dragon archetype. And it's cool, you know, you don't have to just make everything Gyarados. Like, this is a creative take on a past design. Playing with old ideas and making them into something new is awesome, and so it's great that slacking feels so different. So with these three designs, we see a low, medium, and high risk take on the Hidden Dragon. Now, in a vacuum, Gen 3 Gyarados manages to be fairly balanced. Magikarp still comes early, you can see it evolved by the third gym, but it will have a terrible performance. The fourth gym is fire, but because Gyarados has no water moves, it's basically just a firewall. So it's really not good until the second half of the game, where, you know, there's a lot of other good Pokemon in the second half of the game. Actually, big thing to note here is that this is the generation where it gets Intimidate. So it gets a lot better, but there's enough around Gyarados to balance it from being the absolute dominator that it was in Gen 2. The big problem is that Gyarados just completely overshadows Milotic. Because Magikarp is so plentiful and getting Feebas alone is just like an extreme grind, Milotic is just kind of an afterthought. And yeah, it's a pure water special attacker that arguably performs better than Gyarados. The problem is that it's just not really worth it for the effort you have to pay. And so unfortunately, this kind of results in another crack in the design. Now, as we're going to see from now on time and time again, we have this Gen 1 Pokemon overshadowing Pokemon from the new region. And you know, it makes me wonder, what if Game Freak had actually swapped locations of the two? What if they had made Feebas the super common Pokemon that sucks, but of course, you know, once you put in that huge beauty grind, you get Milotic. I think that would have made Gen 3 feel really special. And you know, you're in your third generation, Gyarados has had its time to shine. Yeah, you can get one, and Gyarados is still really awesome, but it's not so plentiful and overshadowing of the new Pokemon of this generation. That would have been really cool, but unfortunately, Gyarados just kind of outshines one of the three new designs. Now, the first round of the Kanto remakes actually do a pretty good job of balancing the line. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that this is Gyarados' home region, so it can't really step on the toes of other Pokemon. Though part of that also is the fact that there are other great water types to balance out Gyarados. So you've got Intimidate, Magikarp is definitely easier to grind, but the big scary fish just doesn't feel so dominating in this game when you've got the likes of like Lapras, Slowpoke, Starmie. So all things considered, Gyarados actually feels pretty good in the remakes. Gen 4, Diamond, Platinum, and Pearl. That, however, is the last time you're going to hear me say that. Because starting in Generation 4, Gyarados finally gets its last Infinity Stone, the physical special split. Just what war crimes are we about to watch a Gyarados with 125 power commit? Stay tuned to find out. Because before we can get there, we first want to analyze how this class of Pokemon evolved in Gen 4. And to do this, we actually need to bring our attention back to the babies. Badu is Roselia's baby evolution, and it immediately gives a small reminder of the babies of Generation 2. The big difference being that this line, along with that of Electivire, Magmortar, and so on, all see a linear power slope that is not indicative of the archetype. There is, however, also Munchlax. With a straight shot to Snorlax, you might think this is a better candidate. It's rare, it's got a really shallow move pool, and it even sees a pretty big power spike as it evolves into Snorlax. But despite being a little bit better, I still don't really think this one fits. So up until now, a lot of the reason I didn't feel like the babies fit in my head was vibes. And it turns out I actually just needed an example of a baby embodying the hidden archetype to figure out why so many of them don't. Similar to the Togepi in Johto, Riolo is given to the player in an egg rather than caught. And upon hatching, you are given a level 5 Pokemon in a part of the game where most trainers are in their 30s. So with its 285 base stats, there's a massive cost of investment. But through a friendship evolution, you are rewarded with the mighty Lucario. And what's so interesting to me is why then does Lucario just so fully and obviously embody the hidden dragon influence? And I think immediately one big distinction you can make is that Lucario comes all at once. What I mean is retroactively adding in a baby to a line seems to have a different effect on how a Pokemon is viewed. Anyone that's played Gen 1 and then 2 knows that there's this sort of backwards momentum to like Jinx, Magmar, and Electabuzz. The Pokemon almost feel like they've been given this hindrance. You have to deal with the early baby stage now, but you're accustomed to getting its max power from the start. But when you introduce the baby with the final evolution, the Pokemon is just viewed in a completely different context. It's just like, yeah, that's Riolu. He's our guy. He evolves into Lucario. We love him for evolving into Lucario. Whereas with Smoochum, you're like, I would have kind of just preferred a Jinx from the start. But that alone is not the only thing. And I think power also plays into it, because there was actually one baby line that was introduced all at once in Gen 2. Togepi is one of only 3 babies that were not retroactively added to the game. And I think if Togetic had been quite good, it easily would have achieved this. The problem is that Togetic is really bad, and so then you almost have this like reverse effect where anyone that was playing Gen 2 as a kid was thinking they're doing the Magikarp thing. Then you get Togetic and you lose all trust in Game Freak. Now, as far as Gen 4 goes, there is one other Pokemon, and that's Combee. Combee can be found after slathering honey on trees. It's got terrible stats, only knows Gust, and evolves into Vespiquen at just level 20. It's got a lot of the markings of a hidden dragon, but the biggest issue is just that it's not really all that good. I still do think it embodies the idea, and the interesting take here was that it only evolved if it was female, but at the end of the day, it's just a little too costly to actually be worth running. But have no fear, because the OG hidden dragon more than makes up for that with its Gen 4 transformation. The physical special split meant that Gyarados finally, after 2 generations, could take advantage of its stab water moves. So with the physical special split, Gyarados can now make use of its 125 attack on water moves, ice moves. Literally, like, this thing learns so much, it gets really good. You've got Aqua's Tail at 35, Ice Fang at 32, you can teach it Avalanche, Waterfall, and now Dragon Dance comes at 44. Gyarados is so strong in this generation that it can actually sweep the entire Elite Four. All of this for a Pokemon that can be caught before the first gym, or just wait a little bit longer and you can get it for free. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Gyarados to its full power. The problem is that now, without any investment cost, Gyarados is basically just a free no-brainer. And what sucks about this is there's not a lot of Pokemon that can compete with it. And this is something you really see in the Gen 2 remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Gyarados dominated the original Johto games, but it was at least held back by a Baron Learn set. Now the red Gyarados gets Waterfall, Earthquake, it even gets Ice Fang to deal with Lance's Dragonites. So it's finally in Gen 4 where we see Gyarados just fully unlock its inner potential. So now, as that wall has really just finally crumbled down, I think it's a really good time to pose the question, why is this such a bad thing? Well, as we kind of saw with Milotic, I personally think that new generational Pokemon should have the opportunity to shine in their debut game. The existence of Gyarados takes away from that. Imagine the case where a new game drops and a not so good player is going along in their journey. There's a ton of new Pokemon to catch, but they've been using Gyarados in past games and they know it's a reliably great Pokemon. This acts as a crutch, and it could even lead to them going on to, miss out on a Pokemon that could potentially be one of their new favorites. It's like, why put effort into discovering new things when, you've just got old reliable? And even for good players, that temptation is sort of there. And I think by this point in the series, you're starting to see that fatigue set in. Generation 5, Black and White. Hello there. Hi, my name's Pokemon Black and White. Nice to meet you. Are you tired of Gyarados dominance? Sick of that big, ugly, stupid fish? Well, welcome to Generation 5, the only game in the series to not feature the only games that you can at least not get Gyarados for a main playthrough. So in what can only be stated as Game Freak's highest moment of brilliance, Generation 5 gave the series a soft reset, meaning that outside of Generation 1, Black and White is the only game to feature nothing but its regional generational Pokemon. What I'm saying is you've got Gen 5 Pokemon, and that's it. Sorry, Timmy, there's no more leaning on your big, dumb fish anymore. You're gonna have to go out there and catch something new. Scary, I know, but guess what? It's like one of the best games in the entire series. Literally only played them once in my entire life, and I'll die on that hill. Black and White are just fantastic, and this is a huge reason why. What's also really cool about this, though, is because we get this soft reset, we see Game Freak take like a completely different swing at this archetype. The first Pokemon we get is Tynamo to Electros. Tynamo has 275 base stats and can be caught in Chargestone Cave after the 5th gym. Its starting moveset is Tackle, Thunder Wave, Spark, and Charge Beam, and at the 5th gym, this is horrible. And you don't get its second evolution until level 39, which with a slow level rate is probably going to be like the 8th gym. However, once you evolve it, you can go back to the cave, grab a Thunderstone, and then boom, you've got its final evolution. So on paper, it does sound a little bit different, but even just, looking from a power perspective and like a design perspective, it very much embodies this idea. And what you see with this line is very much the guiding philosophy for both these two and really just a lot of the Gen 5 Pokemon. The other big one we have is Ferroseed. Ferroseed isn't useless with 305 base stats, access to early Curse, Stab Gyro Ball, and Iron Defense, and you can get one around the same time as Tynamo. It's not useless, but it's pretty underwhelming, and it's going to see a huge investment cost to get it evolved. But what's crazy is just how similar Ferrothorn actually is to Gyarados. Catch Ferroseed like 24 to 27, level 40 evolution means you gotta, push it about 15 levels. Ferrothorn is an absolute monster, and it has 1 4x weakness. Ferrothorn feels so different from Gyarados, and yet it's just like the exact same formula moved around. The last one that we have, and it's really weird, is Larvesta. Larvesta can be hatched from the egg you get in Route 18, and this requires Surf. So you're not getting it until after the 6th gym at an extremely low level. Now, Larvesta is terrible. It gets pretty not great moves, and the big kicker here is it doesn't evolve until level 59, while the cap for the final fight is 54. So unfortunately, Volcarona is a post-game Pokemon. And so while it's got all the markings of a hidden dragon, like even down to just the cocoon sort of metamorphoses into the big scary bug, I don't know, like you can't use it. Generation 5 is just a really interesting bag. The vibe that I get is that Game Freak made a really intentional effort to try and not make the same mistakes with Gyarados again. And so the result is a set of hidden dragons that just look nothing like the ones we've seen in the past. It's a very different take from anything we see in any other generation, but all these Pokemon have great reputations, and I think that tells us that they did a good job here. I think Volcarona probably would have benefited from being like a level 50 evolution. Overall though, Black and White is a win. Black and White 2, however, is hugely different, because you can catch an under-leveled evolved Volcarona static encounter at 35 in the Relic Castle. This is just after the 5th gym, and if you think back, you'll notice this is pretty much the same thing they did in Gen 2 with the static Gyarados. Now, it's definitely nice to be able to use Volcarona, but personally, I don't think this is the best fix for the previous misstep. Instead of not having it at all, they just give it to us for free. I think ultimately that just takes away from how much you can appreciate the Pokemon. You know what's really cool though is that even in Black and White 2, there's no Gyarados. And so maybe it wasn't a perfect generation, but what I love about Unova is just how much room both of the games have to breathe. Black and White forces you to experiment with all these new Pokemon, and then Black and White 2 really did a good job of handpicking the Pokemon to return from past generations. And you can see that by just scrolling through a Nuzlocke tier list. It's a very fun, sort of curated group of a lot of awesome Pokemon from Gens 1 all the way through to 5. Pokemon that you see every time at the top of tier list aren't here, and it makes it feel so fresh. Gen 6. X and Y. Generation 6 shows a few brand new attempts with the archetype, but they all pale in comparison to Gen 6's big change. The first new Pokemon is Florges. Flabebe is easily obtainable on Route 4, just after the first gym, and it has 303 base stats, while its second evolution, Floette, has 371. These are a bit high for the design, but because Florges has a large jump up to 552, we can see how this line very much embodies the idea. Now, it evolves with a stone, but the final evolution gets no moves, so you have to level whatever ones you want, which you could say is like the investment cost to this line. It's a great design, but as far as Hidden Dragon goes, there's nothing super special here. Now, at first glance, Malamar is another Pokemon you might want to place here. Inkay has 288 base stats, while Malamar is high 400s. And more importantly, this line really looks like it wants to be a Hidden Dragon. The reason I wouldn't classify it as one, though, is that Inkay has great moves that help it, while Malamar ends up being kind of mediocre. Now, Dragalge is exclusive to Y, with Skrelp having 320 base stats and then evolving into 494. And so this is one that I would say is actually taking a lot of inspiration from the Gen 5 idea, but it's again just like not that strong, so it doesn't really stand out. And that's because of a thing. See, Generation 6 is more defined by improving existing things that worked right than actually adding new things in. What I'm talking about are, of course, Mega Evolutions. And what's so interesting about the introduction of Mega Evolutions is that we actually see a lot of the main hidden dragons get Megas. You've got Mega Lucario, Alakazam, Gardevoir, and even Gyarados seeing power upgrades. Unfortunately for X and Y, there's a really big problem that just kind of overshadows like anything else we can talk about. And that is all because you are given a Mega Lucario as part of a story narrative just after the third gym. This is a really good Pokemon that is given to the player with no cost whatsoever. You probably can now guess what this leads to. Mega Lucario completely trivializes the game. Like, not just to the point of overshadowing other fighting types or something like we saw Gyarados do, but just like makes every other Pokemon completely obsolete. It dominates nearly every fight, and because there's very few Pokemon that come close to matching it in power, the game ends up just lacking a level of dynamics that every other entry saw. Outside of wanting to add challenge to your playthrough, there's no reason not to run it. And that is the core problem. Now, as far as discussion goes, I am grateful that this exists because it's by far the most clear-cut example of how this design can go wrong. Like, Mega Lucario in X and Y is almost so hyperbolic that it feels like something I would just use as an example. To really paint the picture of how absurd this is, let's draw a comparison back to Generation 1. Imagine if the Magikarp salesman was located after the third gym and he just gave you a free Gyarados. Think about like how that would impact your playthrough of the Gen 1 games. Would you ever pick Squirtle? How would your upcoming fights change? How many other water types would you potentially use? How often would your playthrough include Gyarados? Powerful Pokemon work with checks and balances. And in X and Y, the inclusion of Mega Lucario just throws that entire idea out the window. Really to the point where you can't even make the argument that Lucario in this game is a hidden dragon because it's just dragon. It's just all dragon, no hiding. But what's really interesting actually is in Auras, we see something quite different happen. Because unlike in X and Y, there's actually a ton of different megas you can acquire. Like in X and Y, there's a handful of other megas that you can even get. But in Auras, you've got a lot of choices. So the games end up feeling quite similar to the originals, just with like, you know, Abra, Ralts, and Gyarados being even better. Now, there is another free mega in this game through the Lotties, and certainly this is reminiscent of X and Y's issue, but because, again, there are so many other megas that you can get, I don't think the issue is near as bad here. The games are certainly easy as a whole, which is going to alienate a group of players, but having so many different megas at least makes for a playthrough with a lot of different options. This is a good example to show you that it's more about relative power as it is absolute power. Gen 7, Sun, Moon, and Ultra. Now, moving on to Generation 7, I'm just grateful that we can get back to a place of normalcy. A place of comfort, where, you guessed it, Gyarados is in the top of pretty much every person's in-game playthrough tier list. There's really not much to be said here. Gyarados is still just really easy to get, really early, and really good. Its learn set changes for the better, with Ice Fang coming at 27, Aqua Tail at 30, and even Crunch at 39. And this is pretty much the exact same case in Ultra Sun and Moon. There's really just not a whole lot that competes with Gyarados. What is at least nice though is that Gen 7 does deliver 2 cool new hidden dragons. Wimpod has 230 base stats, but 80 of those are in speed. So 35 attack, 20 special attack, 40 defense, 30 special defense, 25 HP. That certainly, is given, Magikarp vibes. Its only moves are also Struggle Bug, which uses special attack and Sand attack. And then its evolution at level 30 very much resembles a Gyarados-like glow up. Gliscopod jumps up to 530 base stats, also getting first impression with Sucker Punch just 1 level later. Now, Gliscopod isn't amazing with water bug typing, but it's very much giving, Gyarados. The truly interesting thing of Gen 7 to talk about is Cosmog. This is the first time ever that we see a legendary embody the hidden dragon archetype. And what's so especially cool about this is that it's actually used as a storyline device rather than a gameplay one. So from the very start to the end, Lily has her Cosmog around with her, only to later find out that it's actually in fact the first stage of a full power legendary. And what I really love about this is that it gives a larger sense of connectedness to that legendary that we can then go on to catch. Whether it be Lunala or Solgaleo, there's a deeper connection to this legendary compared to a lot of the other ones through past games. A lot of the time, the legendary showing up at the very end of the game, you toss out your HM Slave or your Flyer, tack it on, and then it's like this new, really too strong thing, and it just feels weird. And so it's really cool to see Game Freak actually implement this idea that they've been doing for years into the story. I think it's a really creative step for them, and it just makes Sun and Moon way better because of it. Now, looking at Gyarados from the perspective of Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu shows us a pretty interesting progression. As Gyarados' home region is home to 2 remakes, it gives us a great look at how the design has changed. And obviously that is in a favorable direction. Magikarp only needs to sit in the party to evolve, while it gets to soak in the glory of its Gen 4 onward state. It's a really solid Pokemon, but similar to the Gen 3 remakes, nowhere near the best. Pokemon like Starmie, Lapras, Tentacruel all compete with it, and it is by no means the best water type even in the game. Gen 8, Sword and Shield. Generation 8 shows the series getting back to basics. The first Pokemon that slightly resembles the hidden dragon is Applin. Thank God, by the way. When I was making this script, I realized there's actually a Pokemon that is like a literal hidden dragon. That's Applin. I'm really glad to see that the literal hidden dragon also is a hidden dragon in terms of gameplay design. So you can catch Applin just after the first gym on Route 5, learns Withdraw and Astonish with 260 base stats. You'll find a Tart Apple and Sword, a Sweet Apple and Shield at Axew's Eye, and you can get this around the 6th gym. Now, the evolutions Flapple and Appleton both have 485 base stats, with Appleton being slow and bulky, and Flapple having a higher attack and speed. Grass Dragon isn't a particularly great typing with a 4x Ice weakness and 2 times Poison, Flying Bug, Dragon, and Fairy weakness. Stats are also a bit underwhelming, but they do make up for it with good moves. Appleton's got early Curse, Recover, Protect, and its signature move Apple Acid. Flapple's got early Dragon Dance, Leech Seed, and signature move Gravel Apple. And this makes both of them pretty good, especially considering there's little investment due to EXP candies existing and no level requirements for Evo. I think it makes sense that they toned down the final forms here. They're on the weaker side of this archetype, but balanced with less investment cost. Snom is another Pokemon that takes inspiration from the design. 185 base stats is one of the lowest base stat Pokemon of all time. It's really bad, and then Frostmoss jumps up to 475 base stats. Even a Friendship evolution. So the line does have a lot of the markings, but the big issue is just the Frostmoth isn't really that good. And so it's actually Toxel that ends up being Gen 8's most iconic hidden dragon. Toxel is really unique because it's only one of 3 baby Pokemon that has its final evolution introduced in the same generation. As we talked about before, the other 2 being Lucario and Togetic. I guess Togekiss kind of screws that up, but you get the idea. Now, Toxel is given out as a free Giftmon in the nursery in Route 5, and this gives just instantly massive Gen 4 Riolu energy. It's got 242 base stats, and every one of them is horrible. The one cool thing, though, is they did a little experiment here, and they gave it the move Belch. If the Pokemon has used a berry, it's 100 120 power, which gives it like a very interesting niche. So it's like basically, you know, for a lot of the time you're using it, it's getting one shot, but it can actually do damage back. And I think that's cool. It keeps really bad power, but they give it this little tiny niche that lets it do like something sometimes. Now on Evo, Toxtricity jumps to 502 base stats, and it also gets some really nice moves and interesting abilities. And so while not as good as Lucario, this line very much embodies the idea. And if you can believe it, in Sword and Shield, Gyarados is still an S tier Pokemon. Pretty much just outclassing every single water type added to this game. Like even possibly the starter. That might be up for debate, but I don't know. Like Gyarados is really good. So again, nothing new here, just Gyarados being Gyarados. Now, as far as BDSP goes, Gyarados in the game as a whole is just Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum with power creep. There's just one Pokemon here that I think deserves a mention. This applies to the Gen 4 games as well, and that's actually Spiritomb. While it doesn't have any other stages, I can't help but draw some parallels. Think about it this way, like instead of getting a super weak Pokemon that does absolutely nothing, you're given the odd Keystone. It's an item. It basically is as useful as a Magikarp. And whether it be in Gen 4 or Gen 8, the method to get this Pokemon is a very big, tedious time sink. In BDSP, you're talking to a bunch of underground NPCs, while in Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, you're just like reloading, talking to an online friend. Either way, Spiritomb has kind of got all the markings of a hidden dragon, just without actually having a first stage. Obviously, that excludes it from this archetype, but it's interesting to draw the parallels. And in Pokemon Legends Arceus, not much more can be said. So almost all the new Pokemon added to this game were just more evolutions to existing Pokemon, like Ursaluna, for example. And so as such, none really follow the hidden dragon archetype because you see that linear power scale. So really, PLA falls back on just the old hidden dragons of past generations, like Gyarados and Lucario. And you can catch their evolved forms super easily in the same place as their first stage. So it just doesn't really follow the same pattern. So it's like Pokemon Legends Arceus isn't really about battling, it's about catching. And so the new system abandons these tropes used for battle balancing in favor of keeping the evolution families together. This helps for a more streamlined dex completion process, which, you know, is like the entire point of the game. Gen 9. Scarlet and Violet. So as we move into our final generation, I'm happy and pleasantly surprised that we can end this video on an extremely high note. So with that in mind, let's first actually then get Gyarados out of the way. It's still really good. Like, for example, in one playthrough tier list, we see it ranked in A, which maybe seems like it's a little bit balanced. That is until you realize that this tier list only has legendaries and pseudos in the S tier, many of which aren't even available for a playthrough. So yeah, I mean, listen, Gen 9 Gyarados is still winning. Gyarados is going to probably stay winning for the rest of time. I feel like at this point, it's just one of those Pokemon that is never not going to be in the game ever again. And it just is what it is. Do I hate Gyarados? Yeah, look at this video. But what makes me really happy is that even 25 years after the creation of the original Dragon's Gate, Game Freak is still coming up with clever and unique ways to innovate on this design. Gimmighoul has 300 base stats and only learns Astonish and Tackle. It's by all metrics terrible and can be found pretty much everywhere in Paldea. Yet, its next and final evolution, Gholdengo, is an absolute monster. This is a steel ghost type with ludicrous special attack and great bulk for 550 total base stats. It's also got a crazy signature move, an amazing ability that prevents status, and honestly, it is one of, if not the best Pokemon for a playthrough. The only drawback is its cost to acquire. Does that maybe sound like anyone we've looked at in the past? In a stroke, that is just straight out of Gen 1. Evolving Gimmighoul requires the acquisition of 999 Gimmighoul coins. You can find Gimmighoul coins hidden all around the map, but the main way to get them is defeating Gimmighoul static encounters. They respawn in a small chance each day, so waiting for them can take forever. It is a long, tedious process, and yet, for those dedicated enough, they are rewarded with an absolute powerhouse. And perhaps maybe the best thing of all with this design. It really seems that Game Freak is perhaps more aware of the hidden dragon archetype than some generations might lead us to believe. Because Golden Go is not just another new hidden dragon, it was actually the 1000th Pokemon added to the series. Golden Go fits the original design to a T, and it just feels so good to see that return to an archetype that has been such a fan favorite throughout the generations. And I think that really goes to show you that the hidden dragon archetype is one of Pokemon's best designs ever. It not only rewards the player for raising something useless, but it encourages you to play the game with an open mind. And I think at its core, that is just a massively defining aspect of Pokemon. And so whether that be Golden Go, Gardevoir, or the original Gyarados, it shows us that the highly powerful tools work best when there's a series of checks and balances. And I think that is a really big reason why legendaries don't always work so well, which is a discussion that we're gonna have in another video very soon. So make sure to subscribe for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you so much for making it all the way through. This was our first post Legacy series video, and I wanted to give you something that I think is going to be representative of what we're going to be coming at you in the future. Really hope you guys are excited for the next chapter of videos. We're going full steam. We're here. So if you enjoyed this stuff, we got more cooking. I will see you very soon. Peace.